The wind howled through the dense trees, rattling the car windows as Emily clutched the steering wheel, her eyes straining to see through the fog. The GPS had given up miles ago, leaving them on an unknown road that seemed to stretch into endless darkness. "I think we should turn back," David muttered, glancing nervously at the trees looming on either side of the road. "We don't even know which way to turn back to," Emily snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. "We've been driving for hours." In the back seat, Max stirred awake, rubbing his eyes. "Where are we?" he asked, yawning. "We're lost," Emily said bluntly, "but I'm sure we'll hit a town soon." As if answering her, the fog lifted slightly, revealing a battered old sign at the edge of the road. "Welcome to Hollow Creek." Emily slowed the car to a stop, and they all stared at the sign. It wasn't marked on any map they had checked before, and the paint looked faded, as if no one had cared for it in years. Still, they had no other choice. They needed gas, directions, and a place to stay for the night. The car crept forward, rolling into the town. Hollow Creek was unlike any place they had seen. Wooden houses with peeling paint lined the narrow street, their windows dark and lifeless. The lampposts cast a weak yellow glow, barely cutting through the mist that clung to the ground like a suffocating blanket. There was no sound, no cars, no people, just the eerie stillness of the empty town. "Weird," Max said, leaning forward between the front seats. "Where is everyone?" David shook his head, peering out the window. "Maybe it's just late, and people are inside." Emily wasn't convinced. The place felt off. There were no signs of life at all, no lights in the windows, no movement. "Let's just find someone and ask for directions," she said. They parked in front of a small, crumbling inn, the only building with a faint light in the window. Stepping out of the car, the cold night air bit into their skin. Emily knocked on the door, and after a long moment, it creaked open. An old man stood in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes dull and lifeless. He wore clothes that looked as if they hadn't been changed in decades, his hands trembling as he gripped the doorframe. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "What?" Emily stammered, stepping back instinctively. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, staring straight at her with an intensity that made her shiver. Before they could ask anything else, the door slammed shut with a force that echoed down the empty street. "What the hell was that about?" Max muttered, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Emily said, turning to David, who was looking around warily. "Let's just find a place to stay, and we'll leave first thing in the morning." But something deep inside her knew that leaving might not be so simple. They found a small, decrepit motel at the edge of town. The sign flickered above the entrance, and the inside was as shabby as the outside. Dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a musty smell that clung to everything. The receptionist, an unnervingly quiet woman, handed them the keys without a word. Their room was small and cold, with one window that looked out onto the foggy street. David dropped his bag on the bed and sighed. "This place gives me the creeps." "You think?" Max said sarcastically, staring out the window. "This town is like something out of a horror movie." Emily sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. "Let's just get some rest. We'll leave at first light." But sleep did not come easily. Emily lay awake, listening to the unsettling silence of the town. Every now and then, she thought she heard faint footsteps outside, or the sound of distant voices. But when she looked out the window, there was nothing. At some point, she finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud knock at the door. She sat up, heart pounding, and glanced at David and Max, who were already awake and looking just as confused. "Who's knocking in the middle of the night?" Max whispered. David shook his head, moving toward the door. "Stay back," he said, as he slowly opened it. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Emily felt a knot of fear tighten in her chest. "Let's leave. Now!" Without waiting for an answer, they grabbed their bags and rushed out of the motel. But as they reached the car, something even stranger happened. The fog had thickened to the point that they couldn't see more than a few feet in front of them. Worse, the road they had driven in on seemed to have vanished. "We didn't come this way," Emily said, panic rising in her voice as they walked around in circles. "Where's the road?" "It's got to be here," David said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "It has to be." But no matter where they looked, the road was gone. They were trapped in Hollow Creek. In their desperation, they decided to look for answers. They returned to the center of town, hoping someone, anyone, could explain what was happening. The town was still eerily quiet, but as they approached the old library, they noticed the door was open, casting a faint light onto the fog-covered street. Inside, the library was dusty and filled with books that looked centuries old. Behind the counter sat an old woman, her thin lips stretched into a disturbing smile. Her eyes followed them as they entered, but she didn't speak. David approached her cautiously. "Do you know how we can leave this town?" The woman's smile widened. "No one leaves Hollow Creek," she said softly, her voice unnervingly calm. "Not once they've arrived." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her throat dry. The woman motioned to a section of bookshelves at the back of the library. "You'll find your answers there." They hesitated but eventually made their way to the shelves. As they pulled out an old leather-bound book, a chill crept over them. The book detailed the town's dark history, a place where time had stopped, trapping anyone who entered. Hollow Creek had been cursed centuries ago after a massacre, and every few decades it lured unsuspecting travelers, imprisoning them forever. The only way to leave was to sacrifice one of their own to the town. "No," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be real." But the more they read, the more they realized it was. Hollow Creek was a prison, and they were its latest victims. As the hours passed, things in Hollow Creek grew more disturbing. The fog thickened, and strange shadows seemed to move in the corners of their vision. The townspeople, once hidden away, now appeared on the streets, their hollow eyes watching the newcomers with eerie smiles. Max was the first to crack. "We have to leave. I don't care how. We'll find a way," he shouted. But his desperation only made the others more uneasy. One night, they heard him whispering in the dark. Emily woke to find Max standing by the window, talking to someone outside. But when she looked, there was no one there. "Max, who are you talking to?" she asked, her voice shaking. He turned to her with wide, frantic eyes. "They told me how we can leave. But we have to sacrifice someone. It's the only way." The next day, Max was gone. They searched everywhere but found no trace of him. Emily and David were now truly alone, and the town seemed to close in on them. The fog, the shadows, the ever-watching eyes of the townspeople. It was unbearable. But then, as the night fell once again, Emily realized something horrifying. The townspeople were gathering outside, their hollow eyes fixed on her and David. They weren't just trapped. They were being watched, hunted. "They're waiting for us to make the sacrifice," David said, his voice barely a whisper. Emily shook her head. We can't do it." But the townspeople didn't wait long. As the clock struck midnight, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move with purpose. One by one, they closed in on Emily and David, their faces twisted into monstrous grins. "There's no other way," David said, his voice breaking as he turned to her. "It's either you or me." And as the townspeople reached out, the final choice was made. A scream echoed through the empty streets of Hollow Creek as one of them fell to the ground, sacrificed to the cursed town. The next morning, the fog lifted, and the road out of Hollow Creek reappeared. But only one person was left to drive away, the weight of their decision hanging over them like a curse that would never lift.